All right, let's go ahead and get started.
Hey, Bob. Bob,
Yes, sir, Lewis.
I have one real quick comment when everybody gets seated.
Folks in the back of the room, if you could wrap up your conversations or take them out to the hallway, we'll go ahead and reconvene the American Yield Management Board. All right, looks like most of the commissioners are back at the table or making their way back. So we'll go ahead and get started. Dr. Daniel, you had a comment before we jump back into it.
Yeah, I just wanted to apologize for my bluegill comment. I'm sorry. I did not realize we had such a bluegill aficionado crowd. And I love bluegills too. But I won't ever say another word about a freshwater fish.
Thank you for getting us out of that spot, Lewis. I thought we were going to have to start a bluegill FMP. So I think, all the reports have been given out. As Terry mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, he wanted to be able to participate fully in this portion of the meeting. Tom O'Connell from Maryland is the vice chair of this board, and he has the same sentiment where since given the importance of the yellow eel fishery in Maryland, Tom wanted to be able to participate. So I've been asked to stand in for the remainder of the meeting. So where are we? I think we're at the point of the meeting where we've had all the reports, we've had all the questions asked and answered as best we could. We've had, the report out from the working group that had 4 or 5 conference calls. The stock assessment subcommittee had 3 calls, I believe. So I think, we're at the point where we're not going to get a whole lot more information the more we ask of working groups or tech committees or anybody else. I think we're pretty close to the limit. This gets to the point where the judgment of the commissioners is probably all that remains, and we need to, the group needs to decide how they want to proceed. So with that, I think the best way to craft this conversation is to get a motion up on the board, see what the sentiment of the group is, and then we can, proceed through that. We've got Addendum 3 that's already been out for public comment. We can finalize portions of that. There's also recommendations of the working group to start Addendum 4. It's sort of a similar spot that the lobster board was in yesterday, where they finalized some portions of the management program, and then they took additional portions back out for public comment. So that's one potential course of action. That we've got a little over an hour, and we've got a very full schedule this afternoon, with meetings scheduled till 6:30 p.m. So I don't think we have a lot of the luxury of going too far over the time limit for this board. I think if we get much past noon, I'm going to take a quick break and talk with Paul Diodati, the commission chair, and Lewis as vice chair, and Terry as the board chair. And we'll just huddle up and decide what the best course of action is. But let's see where we can get in the next hour, and then we'll decide where to go from there. So with that, does anyone have a motion to get us started? Mr. Stockwell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate you sitting in that seat. I listened carefully to everyone's comments this morning, and having participated in the working group, I was originally intended to make a motion to approve the working group recommendations and postpone final action until the fall meeting. But to move things along today, there really are a number of measures that can be approved today, including the habitat and the monitoring issues, the pigmented eel issues, the civil eel issues, and the recreational fishery measures. The tenor of this morning's discussion indicates clearly to me that the board needs more time to develop the glass eel measures and consider the yellow eel measures that were recommended by the working group. So it's sort of a backwards way of doing it, but what I want to do is separate the glass eel and the new measures from this addendum so that we can approve Addendum 3 in part today. So I'm going to make a move to initiate Addendum 4 to develop the 4 new working group recommendations: the potential new glass eel fisheries, the glass eel quota management options, the yellow eel quota management options, and the yellow eel limited entry.
Thank you, Terry. We'll get the wording up on the board and perfect that. Is there a second to that motion? Mr. Augustine. All right. As that, are there comments on that motion as the wording gets perfected up there? Terry, do you have any additional comments you'd want to provide?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, we've done a bucket load of work. There's expectations that we get something accomplished today. There's low-hanging fruit. I think we can incorporate that into to addendum 3 and take our time to think carefully through the many issues that Brad raised this morning, address some specific measures that will do the right things for the eels and sustain the fisheries. I don't have the answers today, I do know, at least from Maine's perspective, the answer isn't to close the fishery, and from the states with the yellow eel fisheries, I suspect they feel the same. So, I expect this motion to get modified, perhaps significantly, but at least it's a start.
Thank you, Terry. Other comments on the motion? I think everybody's talked out. Rob O'Reilly.
I'm just wondering about the quota management. Earlier we heard a little bit about limited entry, and that would be something that I would hope there'd be more discussion on, because limited entry is a big step, and I think quota management might be a big step for some states, as there were earlier indications about how difficult it is with each new species that's under a quota. And I would also ask, in terms of quota management, is it possible, in thinking about what's been done so far by the working group, that instead of a quota, that there's a cap? We have a situation where the overfishing aspect is not there. It's a depleted situation coming out of the stock assessment. There were some ideas, I guess, from the reports we read that the landings have been increasing, and I think really, in looking at all the data, probably by 2012 actually dipped back down coastwide to about where it was in 2010. It was only 2011 which showed an increase up to about 1.2 million pounds, which is very similar to what it was in 2003. I think there might be the possibility, given everything that has been discussed, that this could lend itself to a situation of a cap with a trigger rather than another quota until we have more information. I think not having anything beyond 2010 for abundance in other parts of the stock status, makes it a possibility for a cap. You might remember for weak fish, it was a great idea to have a cap for weak fish in 2007 with a trigger. It was a coastwide cap with individual states having a share and of what they already had historically with their landings. The problem with weak fish was declining as the cap was set and declined further. I don't sense that with American eel, so that's just a suggestion, and I don't know if the working group would be able to look at such a situation as well on the quota. To also
Thanks, Rob. The working group did go, round and round, have a lot of conversation on cap versus quota and how those would operate. And if the board wants to include options on quotas and on caps, I think the plan development team is going to need specific guidance on what's the difference between a cap and a quota and how a cap with triggers would operate. And so, if that is the will of the group, I think we're going to need some more guidance for the plan development team as that moves forward. Let's see. I've got a number of folks here. I think in the interest of time, given that we only have an hour, I'm going to try to limit speakers to one comment per or one comment per person on each motion. Then we'll probably even move into the one comment in favor, one comment against motions to move these forward as quickly as possible. So if the board feels that's severely cutting off the dialogue that's necessary, let me know. But I think it's a much more efficient way to move through this. We've had a lot of dialogue already this morning. I've got Richie, then Doug, then Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to make a motion to substitute, and I've struggled with this decision. I'm concerned about tying the glass eel and yellow eel issues together. So my motion to substitute is to remove section 4.1.1 from addendum 3 and task staff to prepare a new addendum to include the following, but not limited to the following. Coast-wide quota. I put in 5,300 pounds, but that's just a starting point for discussion. 5,300 pounds allocated equally between all the states. Adequate monitoring requirements, adequate enforcement measures and penalties, transferability, timely reporting. And if I get a second, I'd like to speak to it, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Is there a second to the motion? Dr. Daniel. Go ahead, Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The 5,300 pounds comes from the 1999 to 2010 harvest levels, and I believe that's the area in which the technical committee has recommended, but that's certainly open for adjustment. We finished a vision statement for the commission yesterday, and the ink is barely dry, and in that we said fair allocation of marine fisheries, and I think this addresses the fair allocation of this fishery. Thank you.
Lewis is a seconder. Do you have comments on this? You don't have to.
I'll go ahead and make my comments because it does pertain to this, and then you can cross me off your list. I definitely think we need this addendum in whatever form it takes, because this is new information that we need to go back to the public on. So I support the addendum. I do think we need to include in there some honoring of our aquaculture commitment from the 2000 plan. I think there's tremendous potential benefits of the aquaculture operations and the opportunities for aquaculture. So I would like to see, and this doesn't need to change the motion unless there's a lot of consternation, but as one of the options in the glass eel fishery, having a provision in there that if we don't have a full-blown, just open, every state has a glass eel fishery, if you have a bona fide brick-and-mortar aquaculture facility to provide some special circumstances to provide them with that competitive edge that they need in order to compete with the Asian markets. And I think that's something that we all should be supportive of. So I think that's that's just an option. The last comment I would make is, and the reason I seconded this motion, is I think it is absolutely critical that we include discussions on the potential ESA listing of this species and make dang sure that whatever we do, we're not increasing mortality. That's critical, because I think this could stir up a hornet's nest with those folks making the decision on listing. If we go out and say we're just going to have a wholesale open fishery, then we could end up back here in a year or two, and we just implementing the moratorium as required by ESA.
Thank you. Next on my list, I had Mitch, then Leroy, then Steve Train. Oh, wait, no, sorry, Mitch. I forgot Doug. He was ahead of me.
Even though Richie and I are from the same state, sometimes we do have differing thoughts on things. I'll state now that this substitute motion has been put forward that I do support the substitute motion. My concern, I understand where Terry was coming from with this, but I had some concerns with some of the recommendations that came out of the working group. I also felt within our existing draft addendum, we had options for yellow eels that I think we can move forward with here. And I'm ready to make motions to that effect. So lumping that in with the glass eels, I knew we had we have differences of opinion on where we should go with glass eels, and I can understand where we might need to have a different addendum to deal specifically with them. The specific problems that I had with the working group recommendations were some of the recommendations to include the most recent years. They're clearly go against what our stock assessment subcommittee recommendations were, that the stock assessment terminal year was 2010, and their recommendations were based on the assessment of the resource at 2010, that we needed to reduce the harvest in all life stages from that point, including 2012, and their results in increase in harvest, particularly for including the time series for elvers, and it includes it substantially, so that we would end up with quotas that were 30%, 50% higher, depending on which averages you have, over what was actually being landed in 2010, or some average for that. So I think that this board, when we develop whatever plans we have, I think we need to be stick to what our stock assessment has recommended, that we're reducing from the point of some average with the last year of data being included in the time series being 2010. So that being said, I support this motion, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Doug. Reading between the lines, I think where folks are around the table, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it seems to be an agreement that the board's going to want to start an addendum for following this meeting. It sounds like folks want to take some of the pieces of addendum 3 and approve those today. And it also sounds like there's going to be a debate on what to include in addendum 4. And I think these two motions, the main motion and the substitute, are starting that debate on what to include in addendum 4. I think we should vote on these maybe with the understanding that after we tackle all the addendum 3 issues, we can come back and flesh out the list of items that can be included in addendum 4, rather than debating all the potential options to include in addendum 4. Maybe we can make that the last part of the discussion if folks are comfortable with that. But in order to do that, I think we should dispense of the motions that are here, vote them up or down, and go from there. So with that, I had Mitch, then Leroy, Steve, and Russ on my list. Mitch, and some of those names were on from the main motion, but let's try to keep the comments on the substitute motion for now.
Well, first, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I support your idea that I think it would be most expeditious if we moved to have some motions addressing the items in addendum 3, what Terry characterized as low-hanging fruit, and then come back to what the different options should be for the addendum 4. So I think that is the better approach, and I commend you for suggesting it. I just wanted to comment also very briefly about the aquaculture issue that has sort of come out of nowhere today and dominated an awful lot of the conversation. Under the working group proposals that presumably will be at least considered in addendum 4, we're talking about the possibility of allowing other states to have some glass eel quota. We're going to debate that. We're going to make a good decision. We're going to have some science, and we're going to go back and forth, and we're going to decide if other states can get into the glass eel business, and if so, under what conditions. At that point, any company that has an eel farm or any other interest in aquaculture or glass eels needs to go to their states and make petitions and lobby their governments and advocate for their position to get a share of that state's quota. I find in all my experience coming to ASMFC meetings for the better part of the past decade, I've never seen a situation where an individual company would come into the board and say, we would like the board to give our company quota. Maybe it's happened. I've just never seen it. And I'd like to suggest that any further discussion about aquaculture be conducted in the context of whether states should be allowed to expand into the glass eel business, because if we're going to go the other route, which is individual companies come in and ask for quota, then most assuredly that has to be done through a proper procedure, not just show up on the day of a meeting and ask for quota. And I know there's a lot of folks out there who will be on that line. Thank you.
Thanks. Leroy?
One of the things that that I'm thinking about relative to a new addendum is to include the idea, and I just throw this out for consideration, but to incentivize improvements in habitat for any new glass eel, linking that to any new glass eel fisheries, so that if a glass eel, and we do this with all kinds of mitigation, and I think probably all of you do this in your states, where say there's development, there's a wetland impact, and there has to be mitigation of maybe twice that replacement. But if we linked that same idea to the glass eel fishery, say a state wanted to take a certain percentage, some kind of take on a stream in their state, to incentivize that by requiring improved habitat of a certain percentage. And there's money out there for this. I mean, there is a lot of interest. There's grants available. A lot of the states here, I think, have had some success in dam removals and those kinds of things. So I think that would be a way to really address this habitat issue, that in part, and link that with this interest in these glass eel fisheries in some of the other states.
Thank you, Leroy. Steve Train.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to speak in favor of the substitute motion with one exception. I'm having trouble with the portion that says of 5,300 pounds allocated equally between all states. I don't believe that is reflective of the current state of the fishery, nor the increased effort that would happen with opening a fishery in other states. I don't know if it's appropriate to make an amendment to a substitute motion or not, but if it is, I would like to make one.
I think you can do that. I think you can go down 3 levels, essentially, so you can amend a substitute.
At this point, I move to amend the substitute motion to remove of 5,300 pounds allocated equally between all states and leave the remaining text.
Is there a second to that? David Simpson. I've got a list of speakers, but that list was back when the previous motion was up. So let's focus strictly on this motion to amend the substitute, which is striking those half a dozen words or so to take out 5,300 pounds in allocation. Comments on this motion? I've got Bill McElroy.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to speak in support of that motion. My idea is that to give an equal allocation at this point is certainly doing a disservice to the state of Maine. In my opinion, I don't believe they've done anything wrong by having a fishery that was legal and properly developed, and it seems a little harsh to give them 1/15 of what they used to have. So I support the motion.
Thanks, Bill. Rob?
I support the idea that this helps everyone to come to the idea of what should be equivalency at some point, but at the same time, the 5,300, I'm not sure the basis for that. I'm not sure why that, and I know we can't go a 4th level, but I'm not sure why that has to be in there and why it wasn't enough just to have the idea that this could open up the opportunity for other states without setting a specified amount that doesn't seem to track more than the 1998 to 2010 average, perhaps, is what this was based on. So that's a little bit of a sticking point for me, that having the 5,300 in there now. It may turn out that with further analysis, that would be higher or even lower. I don't know.
Thanks, Rob. Bill, did you have your hand up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, we would have some serious concern with this motion. I fall back to the technical committee's recommendation that we particularly be conservative with young of the year fisheries. At this point in time, opening up a coastwide fishery is not what the technical committee is suggesting and could have some serious impacts down the road on future recruitment. And again, we seem to keep coming back to a couple of good year classes where we've had some good recruitment. But again, to base that on 2 good year classes from what we know on fish recruitment is a little bit on the skeptical side. And again, we would have some serious concerns with expanding this fishery. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Other comments on this motion to amend? Tom Foti, haven't heard from you yet.
I'm concerned removing the 5,300 pounds out of this. I mean, we basically talked about looking at basically not increasing the harvest. If you take it out, then you're increasing the harvest. Why do we use 2010? That's when the stock assessment period of time is for, and that's what we've used as figures. The other thing is, in order, if we basically keep to a formula what we're going through, you got to do a 3-year life study before you can open up any of your glass hill fisheries in any other states. So we'll have 3 years to look at this, and we can change the quota after 3 years, either up or down. I mean, this fishery sometimes is a boom or bust. I mean, I remember the long battle we had in New Jersey where they had a glass eel fishery, and when it basically, the year that the bill finally died, the market had dropped out completely, and it was worth $30 a pound, and we were going to charge $1,000 for the permit. So I'm not, we're talking about 3 years of a life study before you do anything. It basically gives us plenty of time to increase the quota if the current trend basically stays in place. But I feel at this time we at least put some mark in to basically, you know, we're going for endangered species. People are pushing for that. At least we're saying we're not going to increase the harvest on young of the year, and it won't happen for at least 3 years, you know what I'm saying? And that's my concern.
Thanks. I had Dennis Abbott and Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Bill's comment about increasing the number, I think if people that might be interested in not seeing a glass eel fishery, it might sway the service into making a decision that you would be more likely to advocate. But I did, and I like the 5,300 pound number simply because the technical committee told us we shouldn't be increasing the number, and we initially came here with the possibility of having a moratorium or having a reduction. So I think that starting with this number is a much better idea than not having a number.
Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I read the proposed amendment, it would strike 5,300 pounds. So all that's left then in the substitute motion would be to remove section 4.1.1, the glass eel fishery, from the addendum and task staff to prepare a new addendum. The rest of what follows are things that probably no one would argue about, outlining adequate enforcement, transferability, timely reporting, etc. So that's all it does. It doesn't do anything with regard to yellow eel. That issue would still have to be dealt with. So I just wanted to make sure that I understood what the intent of the amendment and the substitute motion is. Thank you.
Well, I think the intent of the motion to amend and the motion to substitute are to limit the scope of the new addendum to the glass eel fishery and handle the yellow eel fishery through addendum 3. Oh yeah, and silver eel and recreation will be handled under addendum 3 that it's in front of the board today. Other comments on the motion to amend? Look at that. I thought we were almost ready to vote. Doug, go ahead.
Just a comment from my standpoint. I didn't have a problem with, removing the 5,300s because we could determine a different level, but allocated between all states. When you take that part out, it just means there'll be a coast-wide glass eel quota. We essentially have that And it doesn't say anything about developing any kind of a fishery, having the opportunity for other states to develop some kind of a fishery in here. So for that reason, I oppose the amendment.
Dennis, the last shot at.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Further reading of Richie's motion, 5,300 pounds allocated equally between the states, I think gets to Mr. McElroy's issue of thinking that New Hampshire would get 1/15th and Rhode Island would get 1/15th. I don't think that's the intent of Richie's motion.
That's what it says.
That's what it does say, but I'd ask Richie White if he
Richie,
would.
can you clarify that?
Well, that was my intent with the thinking that there are some state directors have already told me that they're not going to have a fishery. So with the transferability piece in there, that obviously some states will have more than 1/15th because a number of states won't be doing it, and therefore they'll probably there'll be the ability to transfer that quota to other states.
But Richie, under this scenario, your initial allocation would be essentially 1/15th of the 5,300, and then states would make the decision whether to transfer that or not to other states.
That's correct.
Great, thank you. Dave Simpson.
Yeah, I did. The reason I seconded the motion is twofold. One is because I think to support your idea for moving forward, less specificity now will help. What you were recommending, which I think makes sense, is the substitute motion says, let's set glass eel management aside for the moment. Let's get back to Addendum 3, work out the details, and whatever's left, we could finish off, perfect the motion to start Addendum 4. So that's, that's why I seconded the motion, and in large part, and also it's just a little more specificity than I think we're ready for right at this particular moment.
Thank you, David. Bill Adler, on the motion to amend, hopefully.
Yeah, this whole thing is just to put that line into an Addendum 4. This isn't the final decision on that. It's to put it into Addendum 4 for comment, right?
Correct.
Or not?
No, that's correct. Absolutely. Dr. Daniel.
Yeah, that's my understanding too, and that's why I don't object to the amendment. I would expect that in the fleshed out amendment or addendum, whatever it is, amendment, that it would have various options for reducing harvest of in the glass eel fishery consistent with the plan. The one point of clarification I wanted to make, though, is that I don't know that there's a 3-year study requirement that's sacrosanct at this particular point in time. So I want to make sure I have plenty of opportunity to argue about that, because we need to get moving fairly quickly on this. I mean, we've got folks that have come through the process and recognize that it's this decision of this commission that's going to make or break, their operation. And so, they're holding out, and I think waiting 3 years is just not reasonable or prudent with the situation that we find ourselves in.
Thank you, Lewis. And the notion of the 3-year survey period is included in the monitoring committee recommendations. It's not part of Addendum 3, so that would have to go back out for public comment. Any other comments on motion to amend, striking those words from the motion to substitute? All right. So, yes, Paul.
Just a point of clarification. If the amended motion passes and strikes that language, it doesn't mean that the new addendum won't include as an option setting a 5,300-pound quota to be allocated anyway amongst the states. Okay.
That's correct. And I think my idea earlier was to, move forward with, a basic list and the, notion that Addendum 4 would be developed, and then following the Addendum 3 discussion, go back and decide if there's other options that should be included. With that, are folks ready to caucus on the motion to amend? All right. I'll read it in. I think it's clear. The very bottom motion, and you're about to vote on the motion that reads, move to amend to strike 5,300 pounds allocated equally between all states. All right, looks like caucuses are wrapping up. Those in favor of motion to amend, please raise your right hand. Those in opposition, same sign. Two in opposition. Abstentions. Any null votes? N-U-L-L. Seeing none, motion carries. Motion carries 16-2. So now that change is made to the motion to substitute. And are there any other comments on the motion to substitute once that change is made? Russ.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I go back to your comments earlier on, I think we're just playing with words here. I would have loved to seen us work on Addendum 3 first before we're talking about Addendum 4. I think the yellow wheel and glass eel situation are complementary, if not convoluted, and it's really hard. You know, I can see us easily accepting a 9-inch size limit and the half-by-half mesh and things of that nature, but the glass eel or the yellow wheel quota may make, you know, depending on what we do with that, it's going to make a big difference in what we thought our thought process is in Addendum 4 for glass eels. And I'm at this point against the move to substitute. Thank you.
Any other comments on the motion to substitute? Richie.
Mr. Chairman, if this passes and we go back and work through issues in Addendum 3 and find that there are issues that need to be included in this, there's nothing that stops us from adding additional issues to this later in the day.
That's correct. We can add, yeah, the board has the ability to add options and issues to Addendum 4 at any time since it's still in, hasn't even been drafted yet. Yes, sir. Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that's why I'm opposed to this substitute motion, because those issues are in the original motion. I mean, I don't think we're going to get through yellow wheel quota today, so I think that should be part of Addendum 4.
Thank you, Walter. Other comments? Are folks ready to vote on the motion to substitute? Caucus? Caucus, please. I'll read the motion in while caucuses are going on, just so the record is clear. Move to substitute to remove section 4.1.1, parentheses, the glass eel fishery, from Addendum 3 and task staff to prepare a new addendum, including but not limited to the following. Issue 1, coastwide glass eel quota. Issue 2, outline adequate monitoring requirements. Issue 3, outline adequate enforcement measures and penalties. Issue 4, transferability. Issue 5, timely reporting. Motion by Mr. White, second by Dr. Daniel. All those in favor of the motion to substitute, please raise your right hand. Those opposed, like sign. Sorry. Any abstentions? Null votes. N-U-L-L. Motion carries. 14 votes in favor, 4 in opposition. So now this becomes our main motion. Any need for discussion? I hope not. All right. Seeing no hands. Is there a need to caucus? No, folks are shaking their head no. Those in favor of the main motion, please raise your right hand. Those opposed, like sign. Abstentions, null votes. Motion carries, 14 votes in favor, 4 in opposition. So I think that brings us to the point where we're going to start tackling the, according to Terry, low-hanging fruit. So let's go into Addendum 3, tackle some of the issues that hopefully are relatively straightforward, and then we'll move back to this addendum if we need to. Mr. Diodati.
I just wanted to respond or comment to remarks made earlier before we get another motion on the table, so while the table is open. And it's got to do with the aquaculture discussion that was brought to us today. It is an issue that I'm not as familiar with as I should be, so I'm glad that I heard it today, and I think it was appropriate to bring that issue before the board, because I think this fishery, with this fishery, we're facing a very unique situation. In fact, we have significant precedent in federal law that protects American interest in the United States when it comes to allocating quotas. And what those laws do is that it makes sure that that quota is allocated first and foremost to American companies. And what we have here is a situation where this product is being sold in Asian markets. And certainly it's probably being sold by American businesses, but the product is entirely exported, and I'm talking about the glass eel fishery. What we have is a company that's established itself through significant investment, and it cannot survive without the input of glass eel. There has to be some production of glass eels for these companies. If we're going to nurture them, they have to have that. And it's not possible for these companies to compete with these Asian markets. All of this product is being exported. So I'm glad that that issue was brought before me and educated me. And, I think it is something for us to consider, and whether or not we might want to, in this allocation scheme that we're going to talk about in Addendum 4, we might want to consider domestic allocation of a glass eel portion of the quota.
It's a good idea, Paul. Keep that in mind when we get back to Addendum 4 in the list of options. I think it's reasonable. Dr. Daniel.
I just want to say I agree with everything he said.
Paul, you've already got support. You're on your way. You don't even have a motion yet. Is there another hand down that end of the table? Okay. All right. Motions on Amendment 3. Let's jump into those, and hopefully we can move through a number of these fairly quickly. Doug Grout. Doug's crafting the perfect motion. Hang on.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a motion to address the yellow eel fishery under Section 4.1.2. And my motion is to adopt option 2 under Section 4.1.2, increase in minimum size, specifically to 9 inches. And then, would you like to take these individually? Because I'm going to also offer a gear restriction option.
I think we can do that together. They're
Okay.
linked.
And then under option 3, gear restrictions, I would move adoption of sub-option 3B, a 3/4 by 1/2 inch minimum mesh size. And then under option 5, I think it is, yes, I would also move adoption of option 5, reporting requirements that would require states and jurisdictions with commercial yellow eel fisheries to implement trip-level ticket system for dealer and harvest reporting. And that's my motion.
Thank you, Doug. Is there a second to that motion as we get it up on the board? Bill McElroy, thank you. Seconds that. So there's three distinct portions of the motion. Hopefully we can keep them together and vote on that as one without a motion to separate the question. Comments on the motion. John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought we had been discussing, especially in the working group, half by half as the minimum mesh size, not 3/4 by half. Can we put a motion up to change that to half by half?
Let's see. See if Doug's willing to consider that. If not, we can definitely make a motion to amend.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what the requirement was because I was trying to make sure staff had the correct motion up there. What was the suggestion?
John Clark asked the question. The working group was recommending that the gear modification or gear restriction be a mesh of 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch rather than the 3/4 by 1/2 that you had. And we were just checking if you wanted to endorse the working group recommendation or maintain the wording you have on the board.
My intent without having was this particular mesh requirement because it's an option that went out to public hearing, and the working group requirement, I hadn't seen any analysis or comments by the technical committee or stock assessment subcommittee as to whether that was an appropriate mesh size to be able to use. So I'm going to go with this until if the technical committee has a formal report that says 1/2 by 1/2 does it, then I'm fine with it.
Brad can comment on that.
The 1/2 by 1/2 was most associated with a 9-inch minimum size, whereas the 3/4 by 1/2 would allow more escapement of 10 and 11-inch eels, which I think some jurisdictions were uncomfortable with.
Okay, then I'd be willing to make it 1/2 by 1/2. If that's appropriate, I assume having status quo, and is this between status quo and the 3/4 by 1/2 if we went 1/2 by 1/2?
That's the opinion of the working group. That is between those. That was discussed quite a bit on some of the conference calls, so they were comfortable with that. Bill McElroy, you seconded that. Are you comfortable with that change? Okay. Comments on the motion now. David Simpson.
Yeah, thanks. Doug, I guess since it's your motion, I'm a little concerned about the reporting requirement, trip ticket system sort of thing for eels. It wouldn't fit in our model of dealer reporting, and because most of this would not go through a seafood dealer, but would go through maybe a bait dealer, and those folks aren't even in our statutes. We'd have to work with inland fisheries. They don't have any kind of reporting requirements that all the other species we talk about do. So I'm not sure how that will work in practice. I don't know if others have that same issue, but this might be some kid selling eels to a tackle shop, and they wouldn't be in our dealer reporting system.
So thank you, Dave. Jim?
Yeah, and I have the same concern as Dave brought up. I mean, we'd be in the same situation. We don't really have that. We've got a freshwater and a saltwater one, and we're now putting a burden on. So,
Doug.
Well, clearly this was an option that we approved to go out to public hearing, and if those concerns were something that you had at that particular point in time, we probably should have included a different option than this. Maybe added a 6th option about reporting requirements, but I assumed since this board approved this option for public hearing without any other option for reporting other than status quo, and we're trying to improve the reporting system for this, that this would be an appropriate system. I know for my 99 pounds of eels that we land every year, we could comply with this with our reporting system, because we have both a fishery and then anybody that would sell, we just have to require the dealers to report to us. So that's my motion with this. If you have other ideas that may improve the reporting system, you can make an amendment.
All right, I have Adam Nowalski, then Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The working group recommendation for the option 5 was tied to if a quota-based management program was implemented. Since we're not at that point yet with this motion, I'm going to move to amend this to remove option 5 for trip-level reporting requirements.
Thank you, Adam. Is there a second to the motion to remove the reporting requirement segment? Jim Gilmore. All right, so now let's focus our conversation just on the motion to amend, which is to strike that portion of the main motion. Adam.
And I just want to be clear, Mr. Chairman, as the discussion moves through the day, that that's not to remove the reporting requirements entirely. We get to a point where we discuss quota management today or a future addendum. This intent is not to strike it forever.
Great, thank you. Doug?
So I'm going to speak against this motion because I think one of the things that we oftentimes are looking for as we, if we decide to go to quota management, is what have our landings actually been? And if we don't start improving our commercial and recreational landings data collection system, it's going to make the determination of what a quota should be a little bit more uncertain. So what I'm trying to do here is let's get ahead of the curve. Let's put in these basic measures that may reduce harvest slight amount, and then if we decide in the future we have a need for a quota on yellow heels, then we will have good, high-quality data to base those quotas on. Have it in place ahead of time. Let's not wait until it happens.
Thanks, Doug. Rob O'Reilly.
Yeah, I'm not sure this will help, but on the reporting, I guess it depends on how things are reported. So if there's not a federal report somewhere under SAFES, then this would be a pretty daunting task probably for some states right now.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Other comments on the motion to amend? Seeing none, is there need to caucus? Doesn't look like it. All those in favor of the motion to amend, please raise your right hand. Those opposed, like sign. Somehow we gained a vote in that. Somebody voted twice or did something. So somebody's up to something. No, let's try that vote again. Those in favor of the motion to amend, please raise your right hand now and high. All right, thank you. Now, those opposed, like sign. The motion fails on a lack of majority, 9-9. So the main motion remains as it originally was stated by Mr. Grout. Mitch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doug, maybe I'm addressing this to you, and perhaps you can address the issue with a friendly. I don't want to make a friendly amendment, but maybe you can tweak the words. But as I recall, the technical committee has said that the half-by-half mesh is really going to be the cutoff of what kind of eel the half-by-half mesh is going to retain. Goes all the way down to like 8.5 or 8.75 inches, if I'm not mistaken. I think we talked at the working group that if we were trying to accomplish the 9 inches by the half by half, we're still going to have this little bit of overlap where some smaller eels are going to come in. So since the group has not endorsed the idea of half by 3/4, which would have eliminated that problem, the alternative seems to me that there has to be at least some kind of a tolerance in place, because it's a fact, the half by half will still be retaining some eels under 9 inches, and law enforcement has told us repeatedly that they do not want to measure eels. They want to enforce size limits through the gear requirement. So it is a little bit of a sticky wicket, but I don't know if we can, if there's a precedent for what is an appropriate tolerance. And let me also preface those, let me just add that I did think that the half by 3/4 along with the 9 inches might have been the better solution, but I understand that's not the will of the board. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. Rob?
I was just going to ask, I know the working group didn't cover everything, but it goes back to 1998 when we implemented the half-inch by half-inch, but at the same time, there's an escape panel in eel pots of a half-inch by 1 inch, 4 inches by 4 inches if it's square or rectangular, and I was wondering if that even came up with the work group or with the subcommittee in any way, and if it could at least get some public comment out there, it might address some of this tolerance issue. It certainly had a pretty good effect for our harvesters.
Rob, if I remember right, the working group had a description of everyone's gear requirements, so, you know, including Virginia's escape panel, but the working group did not spend a lot of time talking about escape panels or the specifics of Virginia's setup.
May I follow up?
Please.
Does that mean it might be worthwhile to get some information out there about it and see how this goes? I mean, it's good that everyone's going to be at least looking at the half-inch by half-inch, but the escape panel is probably an important component as well.
Are you suggesting potentially including that in Addendum 4 for additional comment, not deciding on the gear now, or a different course of action?
I think if I say go to Addendum 4, it probably will not meet with approval here. I'm just wondering if that can be included as a friendly amendment somehow in this motion.
Go ahead, Doug. Hang on, Rob. We'll get back to you.
Rob, maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, but if you're saying that you want to have the option of adding in a half-inch by 1 inch escape panel, to me, that's more conservative than this option that we may be approving, and so that any state could put that in as more conservative. But maybe are you saying that we do that escape panel instead of the half by half? I'm a little bit confused.
May I?
Please, Rob.
Okay. No, it's in combination, Doug, and I guess when you look at the table of what's expected to go to a 9-inch size limit, minimum size limit, the savings are rather small. And I would think the comments also about you're still going to have eels under 9 inches with the half-inch by half-inch that Mitchell raised. That's one of the reasons why the escape panel was utilized in Virginia. So it's a 4-inch square, it's a half-inch by 1 inch. And I think it would just add benefit because there aren't that many states who have significant landings who aren't near the half-inch by half-inch. New Jersey's under right now. There'll be some savings there, I imagine, but in the table it's listed as 0% savings. So the escape panel is just another mechanism that affords conservation. And it would be in combination with the half-inch by half-inch.
John.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say, as a state with a substantial bait eel fishery, that we think the 9-inch minimum is adequate and will also allow that fishery to continue. Thanks.
Thank you, John. So, Rob, back to your point. The plan itself did not, or Addendum 3 when it went out for public comment last time, did not contemplate the use of an escape panel of larger mesh size than the body of the than the mesh requirement. In other words, the Addendum 3 language says that if the board changes the mesh size of a pot, then it could be the new mesh size could be used for 3 years while people convert over. So if like I think Maryland has a 3/16 inch mesh size, and Maryland could require their fishermen to implement a 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch, half inch by half inch panel during that transitional period. But it did not contemplate the use of an escape panel with bigger mesh size to allow the eels, larger eels, to escape. So if the board wants to do that, I think that would require going back out for public comment for a larger escape panel. Go ahead, Rob.
Well, I mean, I think I'll take Doug's advice there, that it is more conservative, and I hope other states will also heed that advice probably. I don't think it's necessary to go into Addendum 4. I think that's going to be challenging enough. But I think at least everyone's alerted, and I appreciate you looking that up with Kate to get the specifics on it.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Other comments? Yes, Adam.
Thank you. For those states like New Jersey and New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Delaware that have a smaller mesh size right now, the working group had contemplated a phase-in period of 3 years and a escape panel during that 3-year phase-in period. What would be appropriate? It's my feeling that needs to be in there for our fishermen. It would be cost prohibitive at this point to expect them to change over all their gear by the implementation date. So I don't know whether that would be accepted as a friendly amendment, whether you'd want to amend this at the time to include the option specifically to allow a half-by-half escape panel for a 3-year phase-in period, or whether you'd prefer to have that as a subsequent motion.
Okay. The addendum already includes the language on using a 4-inch by 4-inch panel of the new half-inch by half-inch mesh, but the addendum doesn't specify a time frame. So I think only additional piece of information we need to provide, Adam, would be the new time frame, since Addendum 3 does not include that. So as you're saying, there's a financial burden of switching gear right away. So, over what time period is it fair for fishermen to be expected to fully change the body of their eel pots to the larger mesh? That would be the question for the board, the time frame, not the use of the panel. Yes, Adam.
And I would support the 3-year period as per the working group recommendation.
Okay, let's do this, Adam. Let's handle this motion, and then we'll come back to the time frame in a subsequent motion, if that's okay. All right. Any other comments on the motion? Doug.
I apologize, Mr. Chairman, but a comment that was made by Mitch gave me pause, in that that he had indicated that there is going to be some retention of undersized eels with this half-by-half-inch mesh. And my original motion, until we had the friendly, was based on what's in the document, and I agreed to amend it after Brad Chase's, the chairman's, comment that it would be corresponding to a 9-inch minimum size, and I assume that would meant that no, we wouldn't be catching any eels under 9 inches, because that's what I'm trying to do, is just make this simple, you know, address the law enforcement concerns. So I guess I'd like to have Brad give me, is that the case? Are we going to have some eels being retained that are less than 9 inches with a half by half?
The theoretical retention size would be 8.75 inches with a half by half, so there would be some, but I think that the committees felt that that was probably the best match for 9 inches was half by half. Mitch's comment, the 3/4 would obviously be a better conservation move, but I think it would release some eels in the 10-inch size range, and so there was some concerns about that.
Doug?
Then I guess I'd have to ask law enforcement, you know, I've heard there's difficulty in measuring these things. I know that is because I've tried to measure these things when I was a biologist, but you really have to knock these things out. Is the mesh size really the thing that's going to deal with the enforcement? That's the thing you can enforce. Can you enforce the 9-inch minimum size, and would there be any discretion that the enforcement would have if they happen to catch somebody with an 8.9 inch eel?
I was just talking to Marty about this a few minutes ago, and the only way we really can do it is having a bucket of ice, which is, we're not going to have that on patrol. So the other way is having a mesh bucket, having a bucket with a mesh over it, and pouring the eels on that bucket, and whatever falls through would be illegal, and it would be difficult to enforce. Right now, for example, in Maine, we have a 6-inch minimum size, so we don't have to worry about measuring a 6-inch eel. You know, it's to me, I'd have the mesh size so small that there'd be no way of catching that minimum size eel that you want. You understand that? Do you get that? So maybe you ought to figure that out. That's my recommendation would be to do that.
Marty, you have a comment as well?
Yeah, it also depends on when the eels are caught and how long they've been in the pots. If they've been in the pots for 5 days, yes, they lost their weight, they slink up. But if they've been just caught the day before, they have the bellies full, they will not come to that bench. So, and as me being responsible for hauling 80% of those eels, I don't want to be picked up by him and slapped in handcuffs because I got 10 eels on my truck if they're on the side. So it's very hard what prospect it is, but.
Thank you. Doug, do you have a follow-up? Or way out of the woods, maybe?
I don't know if a way out of the woods, but would you be more comfortable with the advisory panel person as a harvester be more comfortable with a 1/2 inch by 3/4 inch mesh size?
Marty, you have a comment?
It would make it more feasible, but it's a lot of cost to the fishermen. And I believe the pots are not done in 3 years. And if you ask those fishermen that have 2,000 and 3,000 pots to change those pots over in 3 years, it's not going to happen. They wouldn't put the money into it. The market is not there for it, and they would not put the money into it. So the tolerance, you know, in all fairness, you maybe should have put in a tolerance of about 10%. That's being fair, if you go with half by half.
All right. Other comments? Jim Estes.
If we implement a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch escape panel, do we need to even mention anything about the size limit? Because we're essentially doing that anyways, and it seems like that would take care of the problem.
That is another option. Pat Augustine.
I would suggest we go to a tolerance in it. I mean, we've heard it from Joe and from Marty both, and if you end up with a 10% tolerance, is that high, Marty? Or I mean, you pick 10% out. I mean, in here they mentioned a 1% tolerance at another part. Would 5% be more adequate? I don't want to split hairs, But let's not create an enforcement issue when you're using half by half, if that's the way we go. What would you suggest?
Well, I'm just checking on by myself. I mean, looking at what you see, what we pick up, I think 10% should be, it's a high mark, but it at least keeps everybody safe and it stops the patrol splitting hairs, because that's where the problem is going to come. So, and that is intolerance that the people that have fished that the day before, they still put them on the truck. They're not going to keep those seas separate for another 5-6 days. So.
All right, a couple ideas bouncing around, getting rid of the size limit, tolerance. What do folks want to do? Doug?
Well, personally, I think having a tolerance makes things, enforcement, much more complicated. And it'd just be much more simpler if we're going to be effectively managing by a minimum mesh size to eliminate the minimum size limit from that. And I'd be willing to remove that part from my motion if the seconder's willing to agree and just go by a half inch by half inch. I also, just to get out ahead of what may come up as a follow-up motion from some of this discussions, if we want to have a phase-in period, I certainly can understand the need for that. And hopefully other states will also have the escape panels in there. So if it's okay with the seconder, Mr. McElroy, can we remove the minimum size limit option? So we're just going to say remove for option 2, increasing the minimum size limit to 9 inches.
Let me check with the board. You know, there's been a lot of discussion
that's true.
and a lot of
It's the
debate on
board's.
the 9-inch portion of this motion. So is anyone at the board not comfortable with pulling out the 9-inch minimum size? And if they are, we'll have to do this through a motion to amend. I see some. I do see some hands up. Dr. Dano, do you have a comment?
I mean, I would support it if that's going to give me my overfishery. I'm assuming that's what that would do.
If you can keep them in a half-inch by half-inch pot, I think you're all set.
It doesn't say that. It just says no size limit.
All right. Is there a motion relative to the size limit issue? Tom Foti.
I support putting the half inch by half inch in the commercial fishery and make that the requirement without a size limit. But again, you're dealing with the recreational fishery, and you really need to keep a 9-inch size limit in the recreational fishery. So, you know, we can handle this differently. You have a gear modification that allows them only to catch a certain amount, but in the recreational fishery, you should still have a 9-inch size limit.
Paul.
Yeah, I think, you know, maybe there's a technical committee, some input on this. I guess the concern might be that if it's not in there, then this leads to the possible development of fisheries that are targeting eels below 9 inches, 6 inches, 7 inches, 8 inches, and that becomes problematic. So I think it belongs in there, but I'd like the technical committee to say something about it.
Well, the TC and the SAS were looking for opportunities to reduce mortality in all fisheries. And we felt the size limit was one area to do that. We targeted sizes 10, 11, 12 inches that would lead to some small reductions in mortality. Through the negotiating processes, we came back to 9 inches. So I think there's still a benefit there, even though it's a slight benefit. The second benefit is the concern over development of new markets for those eels that are above glass eel size, the pigmented eels, 5, 6, 7 inches that could be harvested. There is some evidence there's markets for those. That change would also reduce that incentive to have those new markets develop, which I think is important.
Thank you. Yes, Pat August.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. You know, based on the discussion, I'd like to move to amend to add a 5% tolerance for enforcement purposes. And I'm not sure what language you want to use, but to add a 5% tolerance. If this is going to reduce the amount of infractions, and it makes sense, and Marty, who's been in the business for 30 years or more, knows this is going to happen with a half by half inch net. And yet, a half by 3/4 is not going to cut it for us. And 9 inches is the size we're trying to get to. I agree with Tom Foti. If somehow we can have a statement in here later when we get back to Amendment 3 that we add a minimum of 9 inches on the recreational side for retention purposes. We got to have that control, because I know what those commercial fishermen, I mean, the charter boat folks do. Been there, done that. So I do think we have to close that loop. If we're going to try to reduce mortality, let's do it in a logical way that's going to make sense and is doable. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Is there a second to the motion for a 5% tolerance? Steve Train, thank you. Pat, is this 5% tolerance by number, by weight? Pat, is this 5% tolerance by number of eels or by weight? I think
What's the
I'm hearing
easiest
number
for
is a better way to
enforcement?
go.
Is enforcement going to look at them visually, or they're just going to say, yeah, it looks like 5%? It's going to be a visual, right?
Well, we're not going to have a scale, so that makes it difficult with the weight. You know, Marty's telling me weight here, but no, but we wouldn't have a scale with us, and so number would be.
Be just a look-see visual, probably. My guess would
It's
be.
easy to count them up.
That's the way we'd have to do it, Pop. I don't know how you can handle it.
All right,
Numbers.
so number, Pat?
Numbers.
All right. Pat's saying by number. Any comments on the 5% tolerance and minimum size limit by number? Lewis.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to make sure my head's wrapped around this properly. And I'm talking back here at the table, and we're kind of confused about, what does this do? You laugh, but I mean, the glass eel fishery, if there's a 5% tolerance, then that 5% could be glass eels, right? But that's not. But this, I don't believe this motion is if it's directed to the pot fishery only. But it says, I mean, bycatching the yellow, you could have a silver eel in there too, right? That's not illegal. So I'm just a little bit concerned about how this works. If it's an intent to move forward with an addendum or an amendment to address the glass eel fishery, I think this might muddy it up a little bit.
Well,
if it doesn't, if I'm alone on this concern, I'll get over it. But I just want to make sure the board's clear, and we're clear, the record's clear, of the intent here, and not have somebody, take advantage of it in some way, shape, or form.
I think this is for, as was said, the yellow eel fishery, and the enforcement folks would look at, and Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, would look at the fact that the eels are retained by 1/2 by 1/2 inch mesh, but they happen to be, somewhat smaller than 9 inches. So they still have to be retained by that mesh. So if they fall through that mesh, and they're, then they would be illegal anyway. Is that right, Joe? Joe indicated yes. So I think that helps with the Elver issue. I've got a number of hands. Rob O'Reilly, and then.
Yeah, I just don't think this is necessary. I appreciate it that it may help somewhere, but usually in a state, law enforcement has discretion of some amount. They know where the problems are, and they're going to find them. And I don't think complicating it with the tolerance is really the right thing to do. And I did want to comment on the other motion, but I'll wait till my turn comes up.
Thank you. Other comments on this 5% tolerance motion? Dennis.
I'd like to oppose this motion also, though I would enjoy watching Joe Fessenden count 500 eels looking for 5% tolerance, and I would more enjoy asking for a recount. And then I would further enjoy being in court when the judge asked you about your count and asked you at that point to make another count. I think that we should leave this to the law enforcement people to either feel that they have enough of a problem to make a case or not. If there's no tolerance, then they make a case as they choose. I just don't think this is necessary, nor should we getting so wrapped around the axle to, do this. Appreciating your motion, Pat, but I just don't think it's really necessary or serves a good purpose. But I would enjoy watching Joe count eels.
Steve Train as a seconder.
Thank you. Dennis, I had the same visual when I seconded it. I seconded this, not so much for the 5%, but to make sure the 9 inches stays in. I have a fear, as a trap fisherman in another fishery, that if you do not maintain a minimum size, you, for lack of a better word, encourage the piracy of the undersize eels. Somebody will find a way to set a trap that will catch them, and they will catch a lot of them. I think Paul touched on that. So you need to keep a minimum size in there, not because the trap requirements you're putting in are going to have too many of them, but because somebody will find a way around that, and they will find a way to land the smaller ones. So I thought the 5% might be a good balance. If we don't need it, we don't need it, but I would hate to see the minimum size leave.
Thanks, Steve. Other comments on the 5% tolerance? All right, seeing none, is there a need to caucus? Doesn't look like it. Those in favor of the motion to amend, which reads, motion to amend to add 5% tolerance to a minimum size limit by number, please raise your right hand. Those in favor. Those in opposition, same sign. Any abstentions or null votes? 1 null vote. So motion fails. 4 votes in favor, 13 votes in opposition, and 1 null vote. I just looked at my watch. It's a little after noon, and we're and the low-hanging fruit thing is not going real well. So I think it brings us back to the main motion, which includes all the provisions from earlier. Are folks ready to vote on the main motion, or is there anything else that needs to be discussed? Don't see anything else. Good. Need to caucus? Seeing none. All right. Those in favor of the main motion, please raise your right hand. Those opposed? Abstentions? Like sign? Null votes? I'm losing it. So that one carries unanimously. So we have cleaned the slate. We have no motions on the board right now. Are there other motions for on Addendum 3? Yes, Adam.
Would now, Mr. Chairman, be appropriate for the motion? I would move to have a 3-year phase-in period for the minimum mesh size, during which time a 4-inch square, 1/2 by 1/2 inch mesh escape panel could be utilized.
Thank you. Is there a second to that motion? Jim Gilmore, thank you. Comments on the 3-year phase-in? Terry.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like some rationale, Adam. That's an awful long time.
We have fishermen in our state with a lot of gear where, quite frankly, to ask them in a 1 or 2 year time period, the financial expense of asking them to do it would probably drive them right out of the fishery.
Tom Foti, follow up?
Yeah, we're not talking about a glass eel fishery where you're making $230 a pound, and we're not talking about a lobster fishery where you get good prices. This is a lot different fishery, and to make them go through the expense of changing 2,000 pots or 300 pots, it takes a bit of time because these guys are basically just watermen, baymen. They make a combined income, basically crabbing, clamming, and potting for eels. So that's what I'm looking at.
Also, the 3 years was recommended by the advisory panel and the working group. Richie, do you have a comment?
Yeah, not knowing anything about an eel pot, what about location of that escape panel? Does it make any difference?
Well, obviously, if the pot sets on the bottom, it's going to be an issue. At some point in time, that pot does need to be raised vertically, which would present an opportunity for those eels at that time. Basically, when the pot's going to go down, though, a lot of the pots are weighted on one direction. However, there would be the possibility that they could go down with that on one of those sides.
Follow up?
Yes, Richie.
I'd like to ask the technical committee then if they would have a recommendation if there should be a location or an area that the escape panel should not be located.
Yeah, I would defer to the industry. I would think with those comments, you would not want it to be on the bottom on one side, maybe on both sides, midway up, but I defer to others.
Tom Foti.
In my younger days when I actually fished, I used to fish a lot of eels and pot a lot of eels and kept them in pens. And you get a quarter-inch hole in the pen, and they seem to get all out. I lost more eels from a small hole. There's no problem of them. As you pull them up, you see them getting out of the pot if there's a hole big enough to get them out. So you basically pull them up. They'll get out no matter what. I mean, you've got to understand the fishery. And the fishery is, as soon as you start lifting that pot, they're looking for some place to get out. And eels are very good about getting out of anything.
North Carolina and Virginia currently require escape panels. Do either of those states have details in your laws that could be borrowed by other states, or is it not specific on where the panel should be?
Lewis doesn't know.
In Virginia, if I may, it's what I was trying to explain to Doug earlier. The pot itself is a half-inch by half-inch mesh, and then within the pot, if it's square or rectangular, it has one 4-inch by 4-inch escape panel, a half-inch by an inch. And, that also works with cylindrical eel pots. Still have to have the 4-inch square. So it's not dedicated to the placement as such, but it is dedicated to the idea of that.
Thank you. Adam.
From a reality perspective, it's going to be in a fisherman's best interest to place it where it is going to work. Otherwise, it's going to result in a high likelihood of an enforcement violation, and with no tolerance built in, the fisherman is likely to do everything in his power to make sure it's effective.
Thanks, Adam. Any other comments on this 3-year phase-in idea? Seeing none, need to caucus? No, looks good. Those in favor of the motion, I'll read it into the record. Move to have a 3-year phase-in period for the minimum mesh size in which a 4-inch square, 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch mesh escape panel could be utilized. All those in favor, raise your right hand, please. $16 in favor. Opposed, like sign. David. Abstentions? Null votes? Motion carries. 16 votes in favor, 1 in opposition, and 1 null vote. Any other motions on Addendum 3? The silver eel portion or recreational fisheries? Doug?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to try and hit another low-hanging fruit here and go directly over to the recreational section and move to adopt under Section 4.2 recreational fisheries options 2, a 25 fish per day angler creel limit, and option 3, the exemption for party charter boats.
Thanks, Doug. Is there a second to that motion? Bill Adler, thank you. Comments on the motion for recreational management provisions? Well, yes, Walter.
Does that address the 9-inch minimum, or how is that addressed?
Doug did not include that in the motion. Doug?
And to be honest, I didn't see under recreational measures, something that we went out to public hearing with a minimum size limit for recreational. Is that, or am I incorrect on that?
Kate, can you comment on that?
There is a text in the document that says that there would be need for consistent size regulations between the commercial and recreational fisheries.
So I think based on that wording, the board has the ability to include minimum size for the recreational fishery. Doug?
My motion didn't include that, but if somebody wants to make an amendment, that's fine. I just find it kind of difficult to see how you could enforce a minimum size limit with recreational fisheries. But
Thanks, Doug. Let's see if folks want to either amend this motion or dispose of this one, then have a subsequent motion. Yes, David Simpson.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm a little troubled by the exemption for party and charter boats. I thought when we talked about this last time, you know, there was a decent understanding that this was possession versus take, a possession versus take issue. And I don't think party and charter boats are out there catching, you know, eels. They're buying them and bringing them out with them. And to provide an exemption here, I think is just not necessary and can be dealt with in how the take versus possession rule is applied.
I think under option 3, actually, Kate, probably better if she clarified.
Option 3 just allows for the party and charter boats to maintain the current regulation that they're subject to under the FMP, while the recreational fishermen would be subject to the 25 fish bag limit.
Right. So different rules for party and charter boats than everyone else on eels. So I'm going to move to amend to strike the option 3, an exemption for party and charter boats.
Is there a second to that motion? Stephen Train. All right, so now let's focus on that motion to amend, which removes the exemption for party and charter boats. Bill or Rick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I recall it a little bit different, and maybe I could defer to Joe in regards to the enforcement part of this. I thought we had that discussion, and there was no way to differentiate between harvest and possession, so that's why we went forward with the charter boat exemption for those folks that might be transiting areas with a large quantity of eels to pick up customers somewhere else. And so I think there was an enforcement issue there, but maybe you can clarify that, Joe.
Yeah, I agree. There should be a possession limit. I don't think we ought to get into proving take. It should be a strict possession limit. That's the easiest thing to enforce. We can enforce anything, but if you look at the success, we'd have a much higher success rate with possession.
Mitch, you had a comment?
Well, yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know how you could include an exemption for party charter boats and not one for commercial bait shops, because it's the exact same scenario. If you are going to, you know, they're going to be possessing, or they need more even than the boat to possess more than 25 at a time. So if we don't take out the party boat exemption, we need to add a bait shop exemption.
Well, I think the bait shops are covered once they purchase those eels. They're allowed to possess more than 25. It's not an individual recreational fisherman at that point, similar to a commercial dealer or anyone else possessing more.
I don't get it. Okay.
Tom?
There's 5,000 beach buggy permits for Island Beach State Park. One guy will ride 50 miles to pick up eels for 5 or 6 people. And so he's picking up maybe 150 to 200 eels. He's got to have the purchase slip in his hand. If he gets stopped by law enforcement without that purchase slip, then he's in trouble. But it probably would, now with gas prices and everything else, people look to pool their resources, and this is what it's doing, because we want to burn a lot of gas sending 6 people to pick up 25 eels when one guy can go pick up 150 eels for the 6 guys. That's what this accommodates. And as long as you have a proof of purchase, whether it's a party boat or a charter boat or a private boat or a beach buggy, you're covered.
Thanks. Other comments on the motion to amend by striking option 3? Seeing no other comments, folks ready to vote? Need to caucus? Seeing none. Oh. What's that? I'll read the motion in. Move to amend to strike option 3, an exemption for party and charter boats. All those in favor of the motion to amend, please raise your right hand. Those opposed to the motion to amend, please raise your right hand. Abstentions? Any null votes? Motion fails. 4 votes in favor, 12 in opposition. So now we're back to the main motion. The wording of the main motion stays intact, and there's no changes based on the motion to amend. Any comments on the main motion? Mitch?
Well, there's still this issue on the table about unifying the recreational size limit and the commercial size limit. I heard Commissioner Grout suggest that if someone wanted to make that motion to do so, he wasn't going to make it. So I'd like to make a motion that the size limit for recreational catch be uniform with the size limit for commercial catch, as has always been the case, I believe, in our fishery, and was the recommendation, I do believe, of the working group.
So, Mitch, that would be a motion to amend to add that to the main motion.
Yes.
All right. Is there a second to that motion? Pat Augustine, thank you. Comments on the motion to amend, which would add a minimum size limit of 9 inches for the recreational fishery? Any comments on? People are getting hungry and worn out, so we can make some progress. Is there need to caucus on Mitch?
Well, I'll just make the brief comment again that, why would we have two separate, if we think that raising the size limit is the right thing to do and we want to have consistent enforcement, I don't understand why we would have two separate size limits. Again, it's always been the case. The recreational size limit's been 6 and the commercial's been 6. This would be a departure to not accept the motion.
Thank you. I'll read the motion in while the states caucus. How about that? Move to amend that the size limit for the recreational fishery matches the size limit for the commercial fishery. Those in favor of the motion to amend, please raise your right hand. Any votes in opposition? Abstentions? Null votes? Motion carries unanimously. So that wording will be added to the main motion. Is there any need to discuss the main motion anymore? Doesn't look like it. All right, caucus on the main motion. I'll read the main motion here in a minute once it's squared away. All right, the main motion reads, move to adopt under section 4.2 recreational fisheries, option 2, a 25 fish per day creel limit, and option 3, an exemption for party and charter boats. And the size limit for recreational fishery matches the size limit for the commercial fishery. Is there no need to comment? Doesn't look like it. Caucus? We're good. States in favor of the main motion, please raise your right hand. Any votes in opposition? Abstentions? Null votes? Seeing none, the motion carries unanimously. And yes, sir, Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to approve Addendum 3, management options as amended today for final approval.
Thanks, Pat. Let me check if there are motions on the silver eel fishery before that. That's one of the issues that
Yes, sir.
folks indicated they wanted to talk about. So are there motions regarding the silver eel fishery? Oh, Doug.
For the purposes of discussion for this board, I think we do need to discuss this, so I'm going to make a motion to, for section 4.1.3 silver eel fisheries, adopt option 2, seasonal closure restrictions.
Kate has one question, Doug, on that motion before I ask for a second, if that's okay.
I just wanted to clarify that you're looking to approve the language that was included in the public comment document and not the working group recommendations.
Correct.
Thank you. Is there a second to that motion? Bill McElroy, thank you. Comments on the motion, which was option 2, seasonal closure for the silver eel fishery. Jim.
You're killing me, Doug. This motion essentially would shut down the New York weir fishery in the Delaware, which was a recommendation that maybe there be essentially an exemption for that. So if that was not included in what you were doing, I'll have to move to amend that we essentially adopt Section 4.13 for the silver fisheries, adopt option 2, season closure with but exempt the Delaware weir fishery in New York.
Is there a second to the Jim's motion to exempt the Delaware River weir fishery in New York? Paul Diodati?
Actually, there was also, I thought that the working group spoke about an exemption to allow spearfishing in that time period of September to December, and that accommodates some long-standing practices from some of the Native American groups in Massachusetts. So I'd like to see that in place, and if we can put that in there as well, I'll second the motion. I'd be glad to.
I'll gladly take that.
Thank you.
It sounds like a deal, Paul. So we'll get that in there. We'll add the exemption for spearfishing gear. And then that will be a motion by Jim Gilmore, seconded by Paul Diodati. Comments on the motion to amend? Richie.
Jim, I support this amendment. I guess my only concern is that it stay a minor fishery. So I don't know if there's a way of you putting in some poundage or some sidebars or something such that, that this couldn't end up being a large fishery at some point and it would be exempted.
Jim, do you have a comment on that, or you want to hear what other folks have to say first?
I wouldn't have an objection for doing that, Richie. I don't know what that limit would be. I mean, we could base it upon the historic landings and keep it at that, but we wouldn't be able to, we'd have to develop that.
Thank you. We got Bill. We got a lot of hands. I'll work around.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It would be helpful if New York could give us some idea on the size and magnitude of this fishery. These are by far the most important eels we're trying to protect, so I'm trying to get a handle on what we're looking at for the size of this fishery.
Jim, can you comment on that?
I don't have the exact numbers, but I think at its heyday there was about 12 or 15 permits. I think it's down to 3 to 6, and it's very, very small. I think the poundage is, I don't remember exactly what it is. I'd have to get those numbers, but it's a small fishery, and we could, again, base it on its current size so it wouldn't expand. And, again, it was relatively small, both in poundage and number of fishermen that were exploiting it.
Thank you. I had Leroy, then Mitch.
So my question is, how would this reduce mortality on silver eels? I don't understand how it would do that. I mean, is there a significant fishery in other states in that seasonal period, or what's this actually doing?
We'll get back to that, Leroy. Mitch?
Yeah, first I'd like to address Leroy's question very briefly, and that is that there are very few remaining pound nets along the coast that are potentially retaining silver eels, and this would prohibit the keep of those eels. Nonetheless, the Delaware River weir fishery is clearly by far the largest and only really significant silver eel fishery in the U.S., and just keeping it at a status quo would pretty much mean silver eel harvesting is kept at its status quo. But at this point, I'd just like to point out to my fellow commissioners that Mary Beth DeLucia is here. She's the vice chairman of the AP. She sat in on every working group meeting, every AP meeting on this issue, and she knows an awful lot about it. And if the chair would indulge us, if she could have a minute or two just to address this, because she really brings a lot of good information to the table. And
Yeah, Mary Beth, if you could come up, that would be great. And then we'll, as you're coming up, I had another hand, I thought, on this side of the table. Richie, did you already comment? You got it? Okay. Yes. Mary Beth, if you could just kind of characterize the fishery and you know, I addressed some of the concerns about this fishery expanding and, you know, what changes you would expect with this if this motion were to pass.
The fishery is definitely variable. It has been, as you say, up to 6, but up to 12 fisheries. It is the only inland fishery, so it is taking all female, large female silver eels. And I think that's what most people are concerned about. I've personally spoken with multiple fishermen on this. In some years, they've taken up to, one eel weir has taken up to 11,000 fish out of one of the only rivers on the East Coast that's not dammed, and it has some of the highest water quality. So these are probably very healthy female silver eels. At the last meeting we were at, there was some new young folks that wanted to get into this fishery because of prices that were increasing. So I spoke to a DEC fisherman biologist 10 years ago who was intimately familiar with this fishery, and he said, oh, in 10 years it'll be gone. Well, it's 2 more years, and the fishery actually seems to be getting more increase in pressure. I work on the Neversink River in particular, and last year we had 3 more people that just wanted to start fishing these fish. So it's not declining. It goes up and down with years, and it is taking all females. And I think the working group came up with some reasonable recommendations that would protect some of the cultural aspects of this fishery for the next 10 years, but not allow it to expand or grow and start reducing it down. And I think to decrease a new fishery from new fishermen from coming in.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Sorry to put you on the spot like that.
Yes, thank you, Mitch.
yeah, thank Mitch, not me. Yeah, Mitch, go ahead.
Very briefly, 11-pound nets, 110,000 eels, 10,000 or 11,000 pounds per net would equal a silver eel fishery that could reach as much as 100,000 pounds a year. 100,000 pounds a year of silver eels would probably be the conservation equivalency of the entire glass eel fishery in North America. And Brad would probably have a better idea of the numbers than me, but I'm quite sure I'm not too far off.
Other comments on this? Tom?
That PBS special on eels, is this the one that basically almost blocks off the whole river? And basically everything that goes down, it takes everything coming out, all the eels that basically for that 2-month period? I mean, that to me is a problem. If you're basically removing every silver eel that's coming down a river, because when I looked at this on television, it was amazing how much area, and it was really a funnel that basically stopped everything from coming down for 2-month period. So I got concerns with this.
Jim, do you have a comment?
Yeah, first off, Mitch, I going to Mitch's comment, I think we were down to 6 permits. I think there was only 3 nets fishing. And again, this is a real boom or bust fishery. It's heavily dependent upon atmospheric conditions in terms of rainfall, whatever, and essentially they get nothing some years, whatever. The average is more like they're taking 1,000 to 3,000 on a good year. So those are more realistic numbers. So trying to say that this is equivalent to the glass eel fishery, I mean, that's just not right. Again, this is a small fishery. We're trying to maintain that historic and that, you know, that classical existence of this fishery in inland waters. And if we want to limit this down or even suggest that, you know, we could go with it, try to phase this out in 10 years, but to totally eliminate this at this point in time, I think is incorrect. And we'd be willing very much to try to reduce it down to some reasonable number that the board feels comfortable with.
Well, it sounds like folks want to take a reduction, but they're not sure exactly, you know, what they're working with as far as poundage or number of gears. Terry.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for all the tender loving care the Elver fishery got this morning. I've got great concerns about the silver eel fishery, and I've got a motion to substitute the working group's recommendation. It addresses the issues that...
Terry, hang on. We've got a motion to amend. So are you substituting the motion to amend?
I guess I'm waiting for lunch, too.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm with you.
I guess we vote this one up or down, but I mean, this doesn't do it for me. I mean, the working group spent a fair amount of time talking about this. I think the resolution might be in that recommendation.
Thank you, Terry. All right, Mitch, and then we're going to get ready to vote.
Yeah, I want to be clear to the good folks in New York that I do not support the working group's recommendation to phase it out completely in 10 years. I don't think it should be phased out ever, but I do think that there needs to be some reduction. So really these two options are leaving us all or nothing, and it's precluding the middle. And maybe we can come back to it after lunch and come up with the appropriate measure, which is the middle ground. There should be some reduction or cap in that fishery, just like every other fishery is being asked to make a reduction or a cap. And I'm sure we could work that out. I asked Mary Beth to speak. That doesn't mean I agree with everything she said. I do not support a closure to shut it down. Just, you know, it just can't escape. I was involved 10 years ago saying this is a little fishery and we shouldn't even be bothering with it. But, you know, now I feel we should do at least something.
Paul, you had a comment?
Yeah, I'm just, it's getting a little bit confusing as to what this amendment would achieve. And I'm debating whether or not I want to try to separate out my change to allow spearfishing with it. So if this amended motion fails, does that prevent me from bringing back the allowance for spearfishing?
In the interest of time, I'll say no.
Okay.
I think it is fair. If this motion were to fail and it's a motion to amend, you could bring back one portion of that motion,
right,
in a subsequent motion. And I think, you know, and it sounds like Mr. Stockwell indicated that he may ask for consideration of the working group recommendations, which include the exemption for spearfishing.
And I guess I'm just, it's not clear to me what the scope of this fishery is that we're debating, this particular weir fishery in New York. And that seems to be the real issue. And so until we understand the scope of that fishery, I know I'm going to have trouble supporting a motion which I seconded.
Just that. Doug.
Based on the considerable discussion that's we've had over this, I have a suggestion here, and clearly because we're kind of down to an amendment, I would recommend that we vote this up or down, this motion to amend, and then at that point potentially have a substitute motion that we would address the silver eel fishery in addendum 4, and then we can try and work out some of these details in addendum 4 at that particular point, rather than try and deal with it today. I don't know how the rest of the board feels about it, but given the amount of discussion, I think it's something that would be appropriate for addendum 4.
Thank you, Doug. Anyone have a concern with that suggestion? We'll vote on this motion to amend and see where it goes from there. All right, seeing none, is there a need for caucus? I'll read the motion into the record. Move to amend for section 4.1.3 for silver eel fisheries to adopt option 2, season closure, but exempt the Delaware River weir fishery in New York and to allow for spearfishing gear. Motion by Mr. Gilmore, second by Mr. Diodati. All those in favor of this motion, please raise your right hand. 2. Those opposed, like sign. Abstentions? Null votes? 2 votes in favor, 15 votes in opposition. The motion fails. So that brings us back to the main motion, and is there any interest to have a substitute as was suggested earlier? Doug?
Can I make a substitute motion, my own motion, or should I get somebody else to do it?
It's probably better to have someone else do it. Sorry, Mr. Stockwell.
I've been very successful today, so we'll see how this goes. I moved, I don't know whether it be to amend or substitute, but would be to move further consideration of silver eel fisheries into addendum 4.
Thank you. Jim. Well, actually, is there a second to that? Jim seconding. I got you. Dr. Daniel.
I think we could do that. I would prefer, though, to take action for this would we be able to take action for this upcoming season if we did something today? I mean, that's my concern, is that we're talking about trying to make concessions in the fishery, and we're trying to do some things with Addendum 4, but I don't know that we've really done a whole lot to reduce harvest in this amendment. And with the ESA looming, it would probably be in our best interests to do a little more rather than punting again.
So the fall, Lewis, the closure that's contemplated here would be September through December. So are you suggesting have something in place for this September, or are you talking 2014?
Well, I guess my question, to simplify my question, is that by delaying this into Addendum 4, do we lose any protection of the glass eel, of the silver eels that are so important to bluegills?
I guess that depends on whether the states could have implemented, a closure this fall or not. So that's a question for the board. Other comments on that? Mitch.
Yeah, I'll let Jim correct me if I'm wrong, but I suspect that the silver eel fishermen on the Delaware are putting their weirs in at this time. It's basically a late summer construction project to set up the fishery for the fall. So I was going to say, why don't we just table this until after lunch, because I think we could resolve it. But in fairness to the fact that the fishermen are already in the water and it's probably impractical to implement anything until 2014, I would therefore support the motion, because we can get Addendum 4 done in time for 2014 either way.
I don't think that we have the luxury of doing this after lunch. I think we need to wrap this up and get on to the other board meetings we have this afternoon.
I support the motion.
And Dave Simpson's the chair, one of those. He's shaking his head. Yes, we do. No, I'm just kidding. Rob.
I agree with what Lewis indicated about making more progress, and the only thing that was a hang-up for me on the New York situation was that in the working group it talked about effort reduction, and given that there's so few permits, I don't really know what that would entail. But I think if there had been language in that substitute motion that had said provisions will be described by the technical committee for some type of compensation, then that would have been enough for me. But that wasn't there. But New York has had a couple of good years the last 2 years, but even with a couple of good years of all the eel landings, it's about 3% of the total. So I don't know how much of that is silver eel, but I think the big problem is, and Paul talked about it, we really don't know how large this is. So some things to find out, but I'd like to see us do something on silver eels today, if possible, and some states might be able to implement it fairly quickly, others won't, but it certainly would be better than delaying.
Thanks, Rob. Russ?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on that, if we delay silver eel regulations today, and we push that all the way back into Addendum 4, which probably gets through in February, we'll never have that in place by September 1st. We do have a couple fishermen who do catch silver eels in fyke nets, so that we won't have that in place for next year at all. So I see that as a 2015 thing. So I'd rather see that get done right now, if possible, also.
All right, other comments? Folks that haven't commented on where to go with silver eels. We've got a substitute motion to defer this issue and through to addendum 4. So is there any other comment on that, or are folks ready to vote on that substitute motion? Seeing none, I'll read it into the record while the states caucus. Move to substitute for further consideration of silver eel fisheries into addendum 4. Motion by Mr. Stockwell, second by Mr. Gilmore. Those in favor of this motion, please raise your right hand. Those in opposition, like sign. Keep them up. Any abstentions? Tom, is that an abstention? Okay. No abstention. Any null votes? Nope. So the motion fails. 8 votes in favor, 10 votes in opposition. So we're back to the main motion, which is option 2, seasonal closure as presented in addendum 3. Leroy.
So what will this mean to the silver eel fishery? Is there going to be a reduction in harvest, or is this just status quo?
Kate can comment on that.
This would prohibit these fisheries from occurring.
Yes, Mitch.
Yes, I'd like to make a motion to amend the primary motion to include an exemption for spearing and to include a 1-year exemption for the state of New York, which would then give us an opportunity to address Jim's concerns, which I do think is fair, as opposed to going to the silver eel fishermen in Delaware who may have been spending the last 2 weeks building a weir and tell them, you're not allowed to fish this year, take it out, no warning, no notice.
So there's the motion by Mitch to exempt spearfishing gear and to exempt New York for the 2014 fishery. Paul Diodati is seconding that? So it's Mitch, is that specific to the New York, Delaware River weir fishermen?
Yes. I
Paul,
don't know of any others.
Okay. Paul, you're okay with that? Okay. Paul indicates yes. Any discussion on this motion to amend the main motion? Adam.
Just to be clear, Mr. Chairman, I heard you say exempt it for the 2014 fishery. The motion was for a 1-year exemption, which I assume would be from the implementation date that we still have to determine. In all likelihood, they're going to be the same, but just for clarity's sake, I heard you say something different than what's up there right now.
That's a fair comment, Adam. So I think, Mitch, the intention was the first year that the closure would be required of all states, New York would be exempted from that closure.
No, actually, the intention was that New York would be exempted from the closure if it were to apply to 2013. This year.
Adam?
Well, if that is the case, I would suggest that we won't know that until we vote on an implementation date. And in all likelihood, I'm going to go out on a limb here, that the implementation date is probably not going to be this fall for this.
Yeah, fair point. You have a lot more experience than I do in how these things go. So I just want to get a result. How we get to the result, I'll leave it to the smarter guys than me.
Well, are folks comfortable with taking out the New York exemption until we talk about the implementation date of Addendum 3, should we ever get to that point?
Yeah, if everyone would agree, I would just change the amendment to only include the spearing, and then we can talk about New York when we talk about implementation dates.
Paul, you comfortable with that change, just doing the spearfishing? All right, it just deals with spearfishing. Leroy.
Just a quick question for clarification. What's this spear fishery all about? How many fish do they take? I mean, what's that about?
Paul, can you give some insight on this fishery?
I think I'm going to ask Dan to help with that.
Dan, the local spearfishing expert.
No, we actually don't have any estimates, except that was the most substantive comment we got at the public hearing from the local native tribe, that they just wanted that gear to be exempted. So if they're taking the taking eels during the fall, that's a technique that they use. So this proposal was designed to prevent the harvest of exiting eels in the water column. So obviously we thought it's the weir fishery that should be targeted, and this is simply another technique come in the fall that they'll take eels one at a time. We just didn't want to make it a blanket prohibition.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. All right. Other comments? Yes, Mitch.
Yes, and in fact, most of this speared eels would not be silver eels because you spear dormant eels that are laying down for the winter. Of course, we know that a mature silver eel is migrated at that point.
Thank you. All right. Need to caucus on the motion to amend for the spearfishing exemption. Seeing none, all those in favor of the spearfishing exemption, please raise your right hand. Those in opposition? Abstentions? One abstention. Rhode Island? Any null votes? Seeing none, the motion carries 15 votes in favor, none in opposition, and one abstention from Rhode Island. So that language will be included in the main motion. Is there any more discussion on the main motion? Option 2 with the spearfishing exemption. Seeing none, I'll read that into the record while the states caucus. Move for section 4.1.3 for silver eel fisheries, adopt option 2, seasonal closure with the exemption of spearfishing. All those in favor of this motion, please raise your right hand. $18 votes in favor, and that's all the votes we have, so the motion carries unanimously. Anything else on addendum 3? Kate, was it the pigmented eels? Was there a motion needed on that? Or is that's the only other issue that was someone contemplated including in this discussion? So I don't know if anyone has a motion on that based on the recommendation of the working group or anything else. Mitch?
I would like to move that the harvest of any American eel under the auspices of a glass eel fishery, let me rephrase that. I move that the harvesting of fingerlings or pigmented eels beyond year 1 be banned. And I think the better way of making this motion is to say I'd like to incorporate the working group language. Sorry about that. I'm getting tongue-tied. Kate, if you have I move that we adopt the working group recommendations on the prohibition of the take of fingerlings, otherwise known as a pigmented eel tolerance.
Kate, can you provide that language from the working group?
The recommendations from the working group are the pigmented eel tolerance and any restrictions prohibition on the harvest of this life stage. This could be accomplished through the use of a 8-inch non-stretchable mesh, and potentially with a 1% tolerance by count.
Or we'll get that wording in there, but is there a second to this provision? Terry Stockwell, thank you. Any need to discuss this issue on the harvest of pigmented eels and the 1/8-inch stretch mesh to determine what is a pigmented eel? Yes, Doug.
I just need to have a clarification of whether this working group recommendation is significantly different from option 5, do we need to go out to public hearing on this?
This is option, no.
Because I don't see any,
The 1/8 inch non-stretchable.
well, I'll just let Kate.
Kate can comment on that.
So under the pigmented tolerance language that was included in the document that went out for public comments, it just says that there would be a small tolerance, a maximum of 25 pigmented eels per pound of glass eel catch of pigmented eels would be allowed, and that states would have the option to propose other restrictions, such as the mesh size, to meet the goal of minimizing the development of this pigmented eel fishery. So the working group recommendations, just instead of saying this 25 glass eel tolerance, is just saying that they're applying this restriction and potentially through the use of this eighth-inch non-stretchable mesh.
So you feel that this isn't sufficiently outside of the draft public hearing document that would warrant needing to go back out to public hearing?
I think it was more of a clarification on how they would, what would be determined to be a pigmented eel. So I think the notion of the tolerance obviously went out for public comment. So it doesn't seem too far afield from what was included. Other comments on this motion? Seeing none, I'll read it into the record while the states caucus. Move to adopt the working group recommendation on option 5, pigmented eel tolerance. All those in favor of the motion, please raise your right hand. Any all votes in opposition? Abstentions? Null votes. Motion carries unanimously. I think that brings us through all the issues that were contemplated in Addendum 3 that the board wanted to tackle today. Is there a motion to, yes, Bill?
Just a quick clarification, Mr. Chairman. Will the habitat recommendations be adopted? Are they already part of Addendum 3 when we vote to move this?
I think that was the intent. Is there any objection to approving the habitat recommendations as part of Addendum 3 once this moves forward? And the monitoring requirements?
Thank you.
Okay. Seeing none, then it will be part of the package. Is there a motion to approve the addendum and include an implementation date with consideration of what we discussed earlier for New York's weir fishery? Yes, Doug.
Yes, I would like to move approval of Addendum 3 as modified today with an implementation date of January 1, 2014.
Thank you. Is there a second to that? Bill McElroy, thank you. And need to talk about this. Jim.
So I understand this now. I need an extension or, the 1-year exemption, whatever, to get through this, whatever. But then now that we've taken the silver eel fishery out of Addendum 4, I don't know how I get it back in here. So just as a question, if I add it on and essentially amend this to consider the New York weir fishery in Addendum 4 as a standalone item under a silver fishery, is that the way to handle this? Yeah, and I'll make that amendment if that's the way to do this. I can't come up with a better way of how we're going to address this, because a 1-year extension or whatever, or even getting through this year, doesn't fix the longer-term problem.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I mean, you have that option of making that motion to amend if you'd like, unless anyone else has a suggestion. Doug?
Well, we can go back and look at the substitute motion that was defeated, but I would say if we adopted this motion, then you could make another motion to include just your fishery in consideration of your fishery in Addendum 4, because the other motion, I think, had your fishery and the spear fishery, and we were trying to put everything concerning silver eels into Addendum 4, not just the specific part. That's the way I'd look at it, is to do it as after we approve the addendum here, then make a motion to include consideration of your fishery in addendum 4.
All right, Jim, you comfortable with that approach of making a subsequent motion after this? And because that's the next step in this process, as painful as it may be, is going back to the list of issues that's going to be included in addendum 4.
Mr. Chairman, could we bring, if Mary Beth is still around, I just want to make sure that that works with, she understands the fishery a lot better than I do, so can we just bring her up for a comment on that? I think I'm okay with it, but I'd like to hear from her.
Mary Beth, can we put you on the spot one more time?
If I got you right, this year we would be exempt, which Mitch is right. The fishermen are actually building their weirs right now, and we would discuss other options in the addendum 4. I think that would work. I mean, the fishery is from August to November 1st. That's it. So it's a very short fishery. Does that work?
So, Jim, it sounds like inclusion in addendum 4 might work for New York.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, say that again?
Yeah, so based on Mary Beth's comments, it sounds like inclusion of this issue in addendum 4 might work for New York, since the implementation date's not until 2014.
Yeah, it just, and then the question to you, do you think we'd be able to, in terms of addendum 4, we'd be able to have this in place by the 2014 season? Because that would be the only limitation we'd be facing. If we can't, then essentially we would want to try to have an exemption for a full year from January 1st.
Yeah, Jim, I think the intention is to bring draft addendum 4 back to this board either in October or in February, and final approval in May at the latest. Okay. Yes, Rob.
I'm just wondering, option 2 under silver eels passed, and the language that exempted New York was withdrawn from that substitute motion. But option 2 is there, correct?
Yes, option 2 is in place right now, which is the fall closure of...
January 1 is the implementation of that. Is that what, Jim, what you're looking towards, that there would be the ability before that next season starts in 2014, that addendum 4 is in place?
Correct. We essentially want to maintain the 2013 and the 2014 harvest in the weir fishery, and then by then, for the following years, we'll have a permanent solution to what we're going to do with that fishery.
All right, other comments? Yes, Adam.
Mr. Chairman, I would hate to see us feel the need to, clearly we all want to do something with glass eels, so addendum 4 is clearly going to be a priority, but I would hate to see it not get done correctly because of the rush to do something for New York for 2014 for their weir fishery. I think we'd be better served today, and I'll make a motion to amend to include an exemption to the implementation date for the 2014 New York weir fishery.
Is there a second to that motion? Dr. Rhodes, thank you. Okay, let's focus on the motion to amend, which would give the New York, Delaware River weir fishermen a pass for 2014 fishery for that 1 year. Any other comments? Bill Cole.
I think he was raising his hand for me. I'm trying to find option 2 in here to see exactly what it says. I thought it was a seasonal, like a 2-week closure, right?
It's a 4-month closure. Through December unless you have a 4-month closure.
Okay. Thank you.
You all set, Lewis?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis. Yes, Adam.
The motion on the board doesn't reflect 1 year, I don't believe, and it should reflect that. As it states right now, it just states it's a general exemption, but that exemption would only be for 1 year. And again, as I believe the intention of New York is to make a motion to include more discussion about this in Addendum 4.
Great. Thanks, Adam. Any other need to talk about the motion to amend? All right, seeing none, I'll read it into the record while the states caucus. Move to amend to include a 1-year exemption for the implementation date of the New York, Delaware River silver eel weir fishery. All those in favor of this motion, please raise your right hand. Those in opposition? Abstentions? 1 abstention from New Hampshire. Any null votes? NULL. So, seeing none. Motion carries 15 votes in favor, 2 in opposition, and 1 abstention. So that will be added to the main motion. So the main motion will now approve Addendum 3 as modified with the implementation date of January 1, and it'll have a 1-year exemption for the New York Delaware River fishery. Any need to talk about that motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the main motion, please raise your right hand. Those opposed to the main motion? One. Abstentions? 2 abstentions, both federal services. And any null votes? All right, seeing none, the motion carries. 15 votes in favor, 1 in opposition with 2 abstentions. So that brings us to the portion of the meeting where we're going to talk, hopefully quickly, about the issues included in Addendum 4. Jim, do you have a hand up?
Well, I am going to make a motion, but I don't know, do you want it now or do you want to have some discussion?
Yeah, motions are good. Now is always good.
Okay, I would move to add to Addendum 4 consideration for a limited weir fishery for the Delaware River in New York.
Before I ask for a second, I just want to make sure the record's clear that North Carolina was the one state in opposition to that, so we had a full record of how folks voted on that. So is there a second to the motion that Jim Gilmore made? Adam Nowalski, thank you. And we'll get that motion up on the board. Comments on including New York weir fishery in Addendum 4? Are there, Jim, are you going to, the working group and the original addendum had a number of options in that. Are you looking for additional options to be included in Addendum 4? Is that something we should work with you on?
Not that I'm aware at this time. Those options were fine. It just needed to be discussed a little bit more, because some of them were a little bit confusing, particularly the monitoring requirements. So we can discuss that through the addendum.
So, Jim, essentially we'll just take the Addendum 3 wording, put that in 4, and have some more discussion, and you'll have the opportunity to talk more at home on that?
Yes, that sounds good.
All right, great. Any other comments on this motion? Any opposition to including this issue in Addendum 4? Seeing no opposition, motion carries. Any other issues? Mr. Stockwell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Given the grave importance of this Elver fishery to the state of Maine, and before we do it any more injustice, could you lay out the process that you envision that we're going to move ahead with this addendum? I mean, we've been here for 5 hours, and I'd hate to see people making motions on a fly that we might have to, chase their tails on later.
Yeah, I don't know if we have a course set. We did pass. You folks did pass the first motion of the afternoon or the morning, which feels like afternoon. That included some of the provisions that would be included, including transferability and quotas and monitoring and a number of other things. But if there's a couple ways to tackle this, and I know folks are tired. One is the board could give some guidance to the working group, and we can reconvene that group and have them come up with some of the suite of options. We can, I think a lot of folks liked some of the ideas that the working group has already included, and we can start with that as the basis for that discussion. If the board's comfortable with that. If there's other approaches, I think we should talk about it now. But the working group had a pretty wide representation up and down the coast and different interests. So that may be a starting point, but it's up to the group. Yes, Terry.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I think given the comments, the many comments we had around the table on the quality of the work that the working group did, I think it might be helpful for whether it's the TC or the PDT to review those recommendations, and then to repopulate the working group with a little broader board representation. And I would particularly like to have New Hampshire on the working group.
Doug, you had your hand up and you've been nominated.
Maybe I'll delegate it to Richie.
That's a good point.
He's not here, right? Yeah. I guess my personal preference, and I guess this is going to mean we're going to have to go to the board, is that I think we should take the working group recommendations along with the crux of that motion and give it to the PDT and TC and let them come up with something and then bring it back at the August meeting. October, excuse me. Yeah, this is the October meeting. That's my, I think we've had a working group. We have a motion from the board. That's the basis. Let the PDT bring it together, and that's their role.
So are folks comfortable with having the PDT charged with drafting addendum 4, and the glacial section the basis for that will be the recommendation from the working group that has already been received by the board? Does anyone have a problem with that? I'll put it the other way. All right, seeing none, Kate tells me that the plan development team will have to be repopulated to some degree. So we don't have to do it now, but we're gonna reach out to the states and ask for some additional horsepower to draft this document. And the timeline will be bringing this back. Yes, Doug.
I nominate Richie White for the PDT.
Last time he ever goes to lunch early, huh? So we'll reach out to the states and get a few folks to help Kate out with drafting that document. And the intention will be to bring that back at the annual meeting in October. Is everyone comfortable with that? Yeah, so I think, so Kate and I are chatting offline here. The first motion that was passed by the board is essentially captures the main themes of the working group recommendation, and that, again, will serve as the basis for the PDT effort. Okay, beyond the glacial fishery, 2 other issues came up. One is aquaculture that Lewis and Paul mentioned earlier about the notion of potentially considering a domestic allocation for the glacial fishery. Are folks comfortable with the PDT exploring that and including some language, and you guys can take it or leave it at the annual meeting? All right, no opposition there. Okay, then we'll just, the mention earlier was to include the ESA listing, or potential ESA listing as part of the background of the document, and we'll include that. Yes, Dave.
Yeah, on the point about domestic fishery, I completely agree that was a great example of why we want to consider broader opportunity for a glacial fishery, and the idea of domestic aquaculture is a great idea. But some of that discussion made me very anxious about individual companies getting quota, all of that stuff opens up a can of worms in my mind. These are all domestic fisheries. This isn't, TALF or anything. These are all domestic fisheries, and it starts to get you into discussion about what a fisherman may do with his product. May he sell them overseas? May he not sell them overseas? So I think as a reason to move forward with this addendum, it's great, but getting into specifics and set-asides and so forth, I think takes us down a path we don't want to go.
Thanks, David. And I guess, international issues and trade issues and those sorts of things get State Department involved and a bunch of other things potentially. So we'll we can wrestle with that a little bit as part of the plan development team. Dr. Daniel.
And I think Dave makes a good point. I think, though, it could be allocated to a state and then allocate that, then the states would be responsible for determining whether it's a legitimate brick-and-mortar aquaculture operation. So I think there are ways that we can address those concerns and move forward with this.
Thank you, Louis. And the other notion that was out there is the transfer of yellow eel quota into glass eel fishery and that conversion factor. The one, if the board wants to go down that road, the first step there is obviously setting up yellow eel quotas for the states, and the board chose not to do that today. Should those options be considered and that potential conversion factor explored by the Tech Committee and Stock Assessment Subcommittee as part of this document or not? Tom.
Bob, I feel uncomfortable with sitting 5.5 hours at a meeting to start doing things really fast. We're all tired. We've all been going through. Some of us are supposed to eat every couple of hours, and we've been sitting here for a long time. So I'm really thinking that we should basically, wrap this up before we start going any further.
Yep, Terry.
To your point, Mr. Chairman, that was one of the working group recommendations, and when the PDT and the TC reviews it, I think it will either arise or fall on its own merit.
Great. So it's fair game for them to consider it, I guess is the best way to put it. Yep. So that'll be explored, potential for yellow eel quotas. Anything else? Anything at all? I think we're all set. I don't see anything else coming before the eel board under other business. Kate, is there anything else we need to do? PDT has adequate direction. You'll hear from us asking for members. Let's break for lunch. We'll try to get back in about 50 minutes and get the South Atlantic board started. Does that sound good, Louis?
That's great.